It is hard to believe, but there once was a man who in his lifetime flew 487 different types of aircraft, including biplanes, supersonic jets and helicopters. He set several world records and had several brushes with world history. Frankly, much of his tale reads like an adventure novel. Eric Winkle Brown was born in Leith, near Edinburgh in Scotland. His father had served as a former balloon observer and pilot in the Royal Flying Corps, and introduced young Eric to flying at a very young age. Already at the age of 8, Eric was taken up in a Gloucester gauntlet, his father piloting the plane with his younger brother on his knee. It was in 1936 that his father took him to see the Berlin Olympics. It was there they were to meet Ernst Udet, a German First World War fighter ace who offered to take young Eric up for a spin in a Bücker Jungmann biplane. Eric Brown later still recalled how masterfully Udet handled the plane, coming in for the landing upside down only to flip the aircraft back upright at the last moment before setting it down. Such experiences obviously had a lasting effect on Eric Brown, and he was in love with flying ever after. Udet had asked him to learn 2 things: to speak German and to fly. Brown followed his advice. After finishing school, he entered Edinburgh University, where he studied modern languages, especially German. At the university, he also joined their flying unit, where he was formally taught to fly. In February 1938, the Foreign Office backed a trip of his back to Germany, his having been invited by Udet, who was a bigwig at the German Air Ministry. He stayed on as an exchange student at Schloss Salem School at Lake Constance. So at the outbreak of war in 1939, Brown found himself on the wrong side of the front line and was arrested by the SS. But after 3 days of keeping him captive, they simply took him to the Swiss border and let him go. Much to Brown's amusement, they also let him keep his MG Magnet sports car. They simply let him keep it as they made plain, with it being British, they'd have no spare parts for it. On return to Britain, Brown, given his flight training at Edinburgh, was taken on as a pilot with the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve and sent to Belfast for fighter training. That completed, he was then sent to the Royal Naval Air Station at Yeovilton in Somerset, where he flew an old Gloucester Gladiator and had his first encounters with the Luftwaffe. Such was his experience of the Battle of Britain, in a quiet backwater of the fight, in an outdated biplane. This was not much to write home about. During Britain's finest hour, Eric Brown was dumping about in a biplane. The Gloucester Gladiators were at best a stopgap, and were taken out of active service soon enough, not least as they were being shot down by the Germans as though for target practice. At this point, there wasn't much to indicate that Eric Brown was going to be one of the outstanding pilots in history. Then, in 1941, he was posted to 802 Naval Squadron, where he served on the escort carrier HMS Audacity. The name of the vessel may sound a little grander than what the ship actually was. She was in fact a German banana boat which had sailed under the name Hanover until she was captured by the British in the West Indies in 1940. With the Royal Navy desperate to provide protection for its merchant convoys at sea, she was converted into a makeshift carrier and renamed HMS Audacity. Credit for the idea of turning a few merchant vessels into makeshift carriers actually fell to none other than Winston Churchill himself. Audacity's flight deck was made of wood, and her 8 planes were simply strapped down onto the deck as they could not be taken below. It was on this service that Eric Brown acquired an uncanny ability for ship-based landings and takeoffs. A merchant vessel like this moved much more on the swell than a proper aircraft carrier did. Thus, landing on it took a great amount of skill, and so Eric Brown came to be part of Convoy HG-76. Travelling from the Clyde to Gibraltar on the initial journey was already a hair-raising experience. The convoy was in range of German Condor bombers. The Martlet planes, which were actually imported Grumman Wildcats from the US, provided air cover against the Condors, well proving Audacity's worth as a convoy escort. It was on that journey that Brown shot down his first opponent. He was to shoot down 2 Condors in total during this convoy adventure. At one point, the convoy was so badly pressed by German attacks, he went up in a plane which was no longer fit for flying, its propeller being completely bent out of shape. What can I say, it's rare that the armed forces will ask whether you want to take part in a battle. But I guess it gives us an idea of just how bad a shape that plane was in. Eric Brown took up the challenge. It was in fact that plane in which he shot down his second Condor bomber. Once the convoy reached Gibraltar, and the technicians there checked the flight worthiness of the ship's aircraft, they immediately condemned that plane. But now the Germans knew that the convoy would be heading back on its return journey. What followed was one of the great showdowns in the Battle of the Atlantic. The convoy consisted of 32 merchant ships, and initially 17 escort vessels, of which Audacity was one. On their trip from mid-December through to Christmas, they came across yet more Condor bombers, and no less than 9 German U-boats, with a 10th joining in towards the end. By the 21st of December, Audacity was left with only 3 operational planes. The pilots were doing their best to spot either submarines or incoming Condors. It was mayhem. HMS Audacity herself was torpedoed by U-751 and sank. Eric Brown found himself in the water for several hours, but was eventually picked up. The Allies had lost 2 merchant ships, the makeshift carrier Audacity, a destroyer and 8 Martlet planes. The Germans had lost 5 U-boats, half their attacking naval force, including one of their most experienced submarine commanders, and had also lost at least 2 Condor bombers, with another very badly damaged. The encounter was rightly concluded to have been the first big convoy victory by the Allies. Eric Brown received the Distinguished Service Cross, but it was now really that Eric Winkle Brown came into his own. Should you be wondering, Winkle was short for periwinkle, a tiny little sea snail about the size of a thumbnail. A reference to Eric Brown's diminutive size. Let's face it, he was a tiny little fella. His role now was mainly transferred to behind the lines. Now, one would think little adventure could be had there, but in 1942 Eric Brown was to become a test pilot, and this was the era of ferociously fast developing technology in the air. Had he begun the war in a Gladiator biplane, he would be flying jets before it was out. He was right in the middle of testing right from the start. He played a role in testing the naval versions of the Hawker Hurricane and Supermarine Spitfire, these being the Sea Hurricane and the Seafire. For a while, the Navy lent him to the Royal Canadian Air Force, where he trained pilots in the technique of landing on aircraft carriers, but so too did he also accompany them on combat missions over France. It later emerged that this training he was providing was in case during the invasion of Italy the Canadians were deprived of an airfield and needed to land on carriers. But he was soon enough back at work as a test pilot. His career in that field was nothing short of spectacular. With the war in full swing, new prototypes and technological advances in aviation were coming in relentlessly. They all needed to be tested. This was dangerous work and many test pilots died. Eric Brown stayed alive, sometimes by the skin of his teeth, but he hung on in there. At one point, when he had to bail out of a burning Hawker Tempest, he ended up in a duck pond, with an angry bull preventing him from getting out, or the rescue crew from getting to him, until the farmer arrived to lead the irate animal away. To provide one example of Brown's daring do's, at one point he arrived at an airbase to be told that there was a Seafire outside waiting for him. He was to fly it on to another airbase, where he was going to be supplied with 2 more. He was to fly them until something broke, then report back his findings. The fact that he was to be in the planes while flying them to destruction did not seem to cause anyone too much concern. His reputation for evaluating aircraft of all kind continued to grow. Not merely those aircraft the British were developing themselves, but so too aircraft they had captured from the Axis powers. Very early on in his testing days, he got to fly the Fiat CR-42, an Italian biplane not that dissimilar from his old Gloucester Gladiator. It was to be the first of many planes captured from the Axis powers he was to fly. Particularly towards the end of the war, as Germany was finally collapsing, Eric Brown was to be the lead man in the British effort to secure German military aircraft and evaluate their abilities. He seemed the natural choice. He was an excellent test pilot, and he spoke German. The Germans had achieved great advances, especially in the area of jet aircraft. The British were keen to get their hands on as many new German aircraft as they possibly could. Naturally, the other allies were just as interested. One plane in particular one wanted to know about was the Arado AR-234. It was believed several were based at the Grove airfield in Denmark, which was about to be liberated. Eric Brown was given a Spitfire and tasked with getting to such airports as quickly as possible on liberation, and officially to requisition any aircraft he thought of interest to the Royal Air Force. And so when he landed at Grove airfield, he was fulfilling his orders to the letter, getting there as soon as possible when the ground troops had only just moved in. Except the ground troops had been delayed. When he landed and opened his cockpit, he was to find the German swastika still flying. But Eric Brown was in luck. The airfield commander knew the war was as good as over. This British pilot being the only Allied soldier he had to deal with, he surrendered to him, together with his airfield staff and garrison, 2,000 men in total. Yes, Eric Winkle Brown accepted the surrender of 2,000 German troops all on his own. One can almost picture it, can't one? Eric Winkle Brown lying on a deck chair next to his Spitfire as the Allied troops moved in, only for him to sit up and exclaim, "You took your time." What happened in these final days of the war was that various representatives of the Allies were effectively playing at collecting German planes, like football or baseball cards. Everybody was trying to get the full set, and most ended up with a duplicate here or there. What then one tried to do was to trade one's duplicates for one did not already have, and so Eric Brown ended up trading planes here and there. As it was, the Americans still wanted one plane of which he had several, but they had no more planes with which to bargain. Yes, it was those Arado AR-234s, but what could they offer in return? How about an interview with Hermann Göring, the Air Marshal of the Third Reich? Yes, it was Eric Winkle Brown who interrogated Hermann Göring on behalf of the United Kingdom. I told you his life was extraordinary. Due to the extensive haul of German aircraft shipped off to Britain and the contacts Eric Brown made at the time, he got to test almost all available German aircraft. Even the Soviets let him fly an Ailing Blorman Voss BV-141, which they themselves had already earmarked for destruction. Most of these evaluation flights he made back in Farnborough, but there was one, perhaps his most famous evaluation flight of a German aircraft, which he made back on the continent. The Messerschmitt Me-163 rocket plane was a spectacular design, but it was also quite deadly. Its fuel was, shall we say, volatile. High Command had made it quite clear that no Allied pilots should risk their lives trying to fly this thing under power, so others had the plane towed behind other aircraft and evaluated it in that manner. Eric Brown, however, was a bit more of a daredevil, and he spoke German. So he in secret, in defiance of his own superiors, convinced a German ground crew to help him prepare and fuel this flying dart. As usual, he came out of it alive. The only Allied pilot to have flown the Messerschmitt Me-163 under rocket power. But there was another German rocket plane, the Barchem BM-349 Natter. Eric Brown took one look at this vertical takeoff plywood rocket-powered contraption and decided there was no chance in hell he'd risk his life in one of those. I guess it says a great deal about the sheer desperation of the Germans towards the end of the war, that they would build such ramshackle devices that not even Eric Winkle Brown was willing to test them. There was, however, one plane which took his breath away. The Messerschmitt 262, the first ever jet plane to see active military service. It was 100 miles an hour faster than the fastest piston-engine planes the Allies had in the air. Eric Brown flew it and deemed it the most formidable plane of the entire war. But with the war behind him, things were not slowing down for Eric Brown. This was the jet age. Eric Brown was to remain one of the foremost British test pilots and take part in some experimental projects which boggled the mind. One issue that always plagued naval versions of existing aircraft was that they needed to be strengthened and carry much sturdier, heavier landing gear than land-based planes, as they needed to cope with the much more violent landings on aircraft carriers. The added weight obviously reduced their performance. One project sought to do away with that problem entirely. If one were to create a cushioned surface on aircraft carriers, aircraft might be able to do away with landing gear altogether and simply slide to a halt on their bellies. I think you can imagine this made for some interesting testing, and having an airborne daredevil like Eric Winkle Brown to hand will no doubt have helped. As you can see, they actually got it to work, but in the end thought better of it. Another hair-raising adventure was testing the de Havilland Swallow, with the very same model just having killed its designer in a previous flight. As the plane came ever closer to the sound barrier, it began to shake so violently one was no longer able to control it. Eric Brown got away with it by the skin of his teeth. Test pilots were now beginning to come up against the sound barrier. Now the battle was on to break it. And here we find the one big disappointment of Eric Brown's career, the breaking of the sound barrier. He flew in a great many planes which achieved numbers ever closer to that prized Mach 1. But when it came to the official British project to break the sound barrier, in which of course he was chief test pilot, the government of the day pulled the plug. They were very, very close at the time. Later testing revealed that the aerodynamic design of their model, the Miles M52, was in fact capable of breaking the sound barrier. But with the project dropped, the record never happened. Worse still, one had been asked to hand over much of the knowledge gained to the Americans, who not long after broke the sound barrier with the Bell X-1. The honour of being the test pilot who broke the barrier thus fell to Chuck Yeager, and not Eric Winkle Brown. But that should not detract from the incredible achievements of the man. He was the first ever to land a twin-engine plane on an aircraft carrier, the first to land a plane with tricycle undercarriage on an aircraft carrier. He was the first ever to land a helicopter on an aircraft carrier. Most notably, he was the first ever to land a jet plane on an aircraft carrier. The latter record was particularly risky, as the minimum speed of the aircraft involved was higher than the maximum approach speed for the aircraft carrier itself. But it wasn't as though Eric Brown had not already had to tackle that very problem with landing the twin-engine Mosquito on a carrier. But for men like Eric Brown, the word impossible just did not seem to exist. He continued on testing planes well into the age of jet fighter planes. The man who had begun his service in the Second World War in a biplane was soon enough to be flying an English Electric Lightning at twice the speed of sound. Such was the span of the changes in technology Eric Brown got to witness firsthand. But long before he reached Mach II, with his near-legendary status as a test pilot, it was only a matter of time until the Americans wanted to borrow him, and so he was seconded to the US forces during the Korean War. His very first flight was in a new plane of theirs, the F-86 Sabre. Eric Brown later said it was one of the finest planes he ever flew, the Spitfire of the jet age. But for his first flight in America, there was plenty of daring him by his American colleagues to boom the base commander's house with a supersonic flyby. Eric Brown maybe took matters a little more literally than they had envisaged, for he performed a supersonic dive on the man's house in the F-86 Sabre. But as he pointed out later, it is nigh on impossible precisely to direct a sonic boom. It did not hit the commander's house, but reduced his greenhouse to rubble. He therefore got to meet the admiral in charge of the base a little sooner than had been expected. He was fined $20. That said, this was less than his winnings from his fellow pilots. Eric Brown was in the money. During his stay, he was also part of a project to demonstrate the use of British steam catapults on aircraft carriers to the US Navy. He was to be catapulted off the British carrier HMS Perseus, but in an American Grumman Panther. The usual procedure was to take off into the wind, but there was in fact a steady tailwind. However, the steam catapult ought to work with or without wind. The Americans deemed the risk was too high for the demonstration to take place, so the British top brass simply pointed out that they were willing to risk their test pilot if the Americans were willing to risk their plane. As per usual, Eric Brown came out of it with flying colours. The takeoff was a success, and the US Navy committed to steam catapults. He later said that when he finally had retired from testing aircraft, he had experienced symptoms comparable to coming off heroin. He had lived by the seat of his pants for years, an adrenaline junkie. Most of his fellow test pilots had died, yet somehow he'd come through it all. His piloting career was not yet at an end, but this is where we shall leave Eric Winkle Brown. He flew 487 different types of plane. He performed 2,407 deck takeoffs and 2,271 deck landings. He took part in a famous encounter in the Battle of the Atlantic. He was part of the race to break the sound barrier. He landed planes without any landing gear. He interviewed Hermann Göring on behalf of the UK. He accepted the surrender of no less than 2,000 Germans. And he was the only Allied pilot ever to dare to fly the Messerschmitt Me-163 as she was supposed to be flown. That's not a bad showing, is it? All the while he remained a humble, charming chap who just happened to love to talk about aeroplanes. Eric Winkle Brown died on the 21st of February 2016 at the ripe old age of 97. His place in the history of aviation is guaranteed, as the greatest test pilot ever to have lived. But there is one more thing left to do in order properly to finish this clip, and that is to show you the list of planes flown by Eric Winkle Brown. Because sometimes you need to see it spelled out to you, just to be able to comprehend the sheer scale of an achievement. That is all from the cyberpast for now. Thank you very much, and goodbye.